Right now, we want to welcome to the show Dylan Reeve. Dylan, good morning and welcome to you, sir.
Morning. How are you?
Very well, thank you. Now, we can set this up, or we can just basically throw it to you, which is probably makes more sense because there's a really interesting. Let us show them your Substack, isn't it? Your Substack, because there's a very interesting stuff. I think it was Stuff wrote about this in the weekend. But when people start looking at it, we come across your Substack from about 2 weeks ago, writing about this as well, that there is a movement within New Zealand of, quote, sovereign sheriffs versus a new world order, and a very, very small group of single or double figured people. What are the sheriffs of New Zealand? Tell us what you've been seeing and finding online.
So there's a problem I'm going to face, and that is the more I talk about this, the less I seem to understand it and the stupider I feel. So we're about to crash into this issue. But fundamentally, I don't know how. Are you familiar with the sovereign citizen idea? This idea that the idea is that the government isn't really the government or isn't a valid government. Often the government is apparently a corporation, and there's various ways in which they argue this is proven. None of them are real, just to be clear. Like, the government isn't a corporation; it's a government. They're different things. But so they argue the government's not valid, and therefore they argue that there's a whole other framework of law that exists that is actually really what is the law that we're living under. We just don't know about it, and so therefore, if you do know about this law, or you could think of it like if you know about this secret magic, then you can sort of overtake the real law. You can defeat it, and you can, by uttering certain magical real common law phrases, you can get out of debts, you can not be taxed, all sorts of things. So that's that's the sovereign citizen idea.
I watch a bunch of videos online, the auditing guys that go around and audit various groups and police stations and government buildings. It's something that I've gone down that rabbit hole. And you see
the auditing thing's interesting though.
The sovereign citizens who say things like, "I'm not driving, I'm traveling.
I'm traveling. I'm a private citizen traveling." Yeah. So that's interesting though, because there's like this continuum in the States, because they have this really old founding document and the amendments thereof, right? So the auditing thing is, it's all about First Amendment audits and Second Amendment audits, and so you're like the founding documents say I can do this, and so I'm going to see if people let me do it. And sometimes, people are sort of reasonable about it, and there is some pretty specific stuff in the First Amendment that's actually really great for journalism. But also some of them are just assholes trying to get in trouble. But then there's this other situation with the sovereign citizen idea, where you've got this sheriff thing happening now, where people have decided that because there's this common law, that there's some legal framework by which they can appoint new law enforcers, essentially, or that they can create a new legal system. And so that's what they're doing. And as part of that, then of course they've got to have sheriffs, and then they've got to have like courts and arrest warrants and judgments and all sorts of things. And so this specific case of it is a woman in Australia named Sandra Crack, which is an amazing name for what she's up to. Has declared herself the sheriff of Australia and New Zealand for some reason, and they've removed the New Zealand government from. Well, they've somehow made the New Zealand government not relevant anymore, and they're appointing new sheriffs. And Australia and New Zealand are now under one common law, possibly with the United States. They've seemed to have adopted some aspects of the US Constitution for some reason. Maybe Trump is in charge. It's not entirely clear. There are some ideas that at some point there was some great stuff going around that in fact the UK had become insolvent, or the Queen had become insolvent and had sold the Commonwealth to the US government, or to either the US government or Donald Trump personally, and therefore actually Australia and New Zealand were really under the control of the US or Donald Trump personally. Anyhow, so they've got to make sheriffs, and the sheriffs then run these grand juries, they call them, in which they are both the witnesses, the judges, and the jurors, and then they issue arrest warrants, and they're going to stop the unreasonable government and the tyranny that is Jacinda Ardern and they're going to, I don't know, arrest them, and there'll be trials.
I think it's not just Jacinda Ardern, is it? It's actually Jacinda Ardern.
Sorry, it's Jacinda Ardern.
Yeah, it's Jacinda Ardern. Now, we were wondering if that was a bit of trolling or whether that was a bit of intelligence. I notice in a lot of their grammatical and syntax, there's a lot of errors as well. So I'm going to go with more of an indicative of the intelligence as opposed to the perhaps trolling. What do you think?
In this case, I think it is. Sandra Crack seems to write every time her name. Sandra Crack seems to write very hurriedly without much sort of care for sort of grammatical and spelling corrections. So I think that's just a simple typo situation.
Dylan, I have a question. Oh, sorry.
You go, Jeremy.
Apologies for me being back, by the way. I switched devices. I grew up in Nottingham, so we actually had a sheriff at the time.
Yeah.
We've
heard of the sheriff of Nottingham.
Yeah. So I'm actually used to this. One question I've had, and I've had this since the Wellington protests. One of the things they did on this Zoom meeting was sentence the government to death, right?
Well,
now,
yeah, I think so.
I mean, yeah, I think that was one of you may not be in a place to answer this question, but is that not a crime in this country? I remember years ago going to a protest for Mark Middleton, who was a guy whose daughter had been murdered. And he was charged because he went on a TV interview and said that he would like to kill the person who had killed his daughter. And he was charged with a death threat. Is that not a crime in this country anymore, to threaten someone with death?
I think it is, but I think the issue is, right, you're in this situation where there's a real big gray line between what is, free expression and what is incitement or a death threat. And I think the law here is in whatever someone wants to make of it, right? So if the police decide that this is a case worth taking up, and for all we know, they are investigating these people, and they may be preparing a case against them. Richard Civil, who is a sort of prominent conspiracy theorist / sovereign citizen, I don't know if he's directly involved in this particular sheriff's movement, because there are actually a couple of them in New Zealand, and he may not be involved in any of them. But he was arrested just a few days ago for, I believe, for making some sort of death threats through Telegram. He was being quite specific about, wanting to see people hung and hearing their necks snap. Oof. So, I don't know what the criteria is, and maybe police have other information about him, about whether he has some capability to do things.
Yeah, I saw there's another activist, Wellington activist, Rob Thomas, which is another great name, by the way, also the lead singer of Matchbox 20. And he was investigated for firearms recently, I think. So, we're sort of, taking the piss a little bit out of this, but, is there something a little darker? I mean, is there something a bit more dangerous going on here?
So there's a concept of stochastic terrorism, which is a big issue. And that is this situation where, there's a lot of people out there saying these things. They just put this stuff out and it doesn't mean anything. And it's all just kind of, we're just saying stuff. But that somewhere out there amongst the audience is someone who's taking this stuff seriously enough and might actually do it. And so, the Christchurch attack is kind of an example of the very worst that can happen in that scenario, where you've got someone who's taking in a lot of these ideas and a lot of this stuff about, how certain people are controlling the world or doing evil, and feels motivated to make change, as it were. And there's been a lot of examples in the States. There's been, sovereign citizens, and there's been a lot of incels and stuff who've done the similar things, who've taken this information on board and then personally acted on it. And so that's the risk, I think.
You got examples of the pedophile pizzeria type thing, and someone turning up to that pizzeria with a gun and that kind of stuff. Like, I wanted to just to give people an example. This is from the Stuff article. There's a lot of crossover. I think they probably use your Substack as a fairly good source of information there, Dylan. But this is the jury. It says, one by one, the jury voted to adopt the death penalty for these crimes. Days later, one of the meeting's participants, Kerry Reddy, a horse whisperer from Ikitahuna, that sounds like something that Fred Dagg would do, wouldn't it? Who calls herself the Chief Sheriff of New Zealand, posted an eviction notice on a Facebook group she administers. It warned, quote, any politicians or Ashley Bloomfield, Michael Baker, Governor General, that they had 3 hours to leave the country. In a comment, she clarified this meant that they were liable to be arrested. The post has since been removed from the Facebook group. which is more than 11,000 members, really did not respond to a request for comment. There's that. And the other thing I was going to say, and it's in yours, I couldn't find it as I was scrolling through, but I wrote it down. When you're talking about the American influence, you're saying this is in your Substack, of one of the jury members said this. Number one, when they were asking what were the things we wanted to put in, number one would be removing the police. They no longer stand up for their oath to serve and protect. And the reason that that's an American influence is our police don't make an oath to serve and protect.
Yeah.
American police make an oath to serve and protect. So you can just see the QAnon, incel, Trumpism, American culture flowing through this, because they're actually citing US law and expecting our police to be doing it, and our police don't do that.
Yeah, and there's a really interesting thing that's happening. But so a lot of the stuff used to take place on Facebook or even Twitter and things like that. And people were kind of in their own little spaces, so the New Zealand groups kind of hung out together, and it was mostly New Zealand groups. They have a little bit of stuff shared in from outside, but they've all kind of migrated to Telegram now. And Telegram has a lot of interesting features, but one of Telegram's sort of key features that's really relevant here is that it's incredibly easy to share content from any Telegram channel into any other Telegram channel. Right. And so what you'll find is that I'm in, like, I don't know, let's say 50 or 60 New Zealand-based channels that are predominantly speaking about either conspiracy theory stuff or COVID skepticism or something like that. And almost all of them will regularly feature content from US politics and US QAnon channels. And so there's no delineation anymore. There's no, there isn't any groups that are really just single topic. They're all like, people are drawn in for one reason or another, but they're all feeding in, everyone's feeding in their own pet issues from other Telegram channels. And the big ones are all, mostly American.
And I think we've seen that, haven't we? I mean, we certainly saw that on the front steps of Parliament. What started as, being really generous, what started as an anti-mandate protest exploded into, there were 30 or 40 different completely disparate issues going on there. And and we're sort of seeing this in this sheriff's movement as well, right?
Yeah, and I think the interesting thing about the occupation and what was sort of a convoy originally was that was a really clear example of that, in the sense that they took on this sort of populist idea from Canada. It was originally, and they in the weeks leading up to the New Zealand thing, there were just tons of posts about the Canadian convoy movement and the Canadian sort of occupation, and so that was what fed that. That was the kindling for what happened in New Zealand. And what's been really interesting is that their attempt to revive it, this 14 days of protest that is very, very poorly attended, is kind of an example of, I think, where it falls apart, right? And when you've got such a small attendance, you can't really easily ignore the fringes. If you're if you just care about, if you're a nurse who's lost their job, who just kind of cares about the mandate situation, you can't be there and pretend that it's not people screaming about pedophile cabals, because there's only 12 of you there and 2 of you screaming about pedophile cabals. So I think it needs a certain level of buy-in before you can have compartmentalization that lets you just ignore the things you don't like.
There's a critical mass, right, that needs to happen. Yeah.
And so you'll see the Telegram groups, the ones that have like a small, like under 100 or just a couple of hundred people in it, they tend to be much more extreme, and everyone's kind of getting more involved. Where you get up to the groups that have thousands or tens of thousands in them, there's just a lot of people who I think are watching and not really participating, and they're just taking from it what interests them, and so they're kind of ignoring the stuff. And I've spoken to a couple of people. I'm like, do you not get weirded out by the fact you're in this group that's talking mostly about vaccines, but all of a sudden someone's posting about about underground pedophile military bases? Does that not weird you out? And they're like, I don't really pay attention to it, right? Because when it's large enough, you can ignore the edge stuff.
Hey, so here's a question, maybe for both of you, for anyone who wants to jump onto this. If you're watching as well, you can send us a comment. These people have always been around in some iteration. It may not have been exactly what they're complaining about now. What is it about the pandemic and the vaccine that seems to have drawn them out into the public so much more? I guess you'd probably go Trump, pandemic, vaccine. There's sort of a line to drawing them out so much more publicly, to be so much more confident and comfortable with sharing these lunatic positions. And I guess even though we may still be talking about a very small number of people, maybe, as Jeremy just said, get into that critical mass that they're big enough that there is some significant noise being made around these kinds of ideas.
Well, can I throw in a suggestion, and then Dylan, I'd like your response to it. I mean, I think the reason for this is because this is the first thing in the social media age that we've had, which is global.
Yeah, that would be almost exactly my thoughts.
Yeah, this pandemic is happening everywhere. You know, this is not Pizzagate. You know, this is not something that's happening in the States. It's not something that's happening in a particular state. This is global. So you do have this critical mass. You've got people who are complaining about this in Germany and Spain and Portugal and Greece. And so yeah, I mean that's my opinion on it.
Yeah, I think that's exactly the case. And you've kind of got this situation. It's not just that the pandemic is global. It's that it was global, and we were all experiencing the same thing. So you know, it's not even like, if you think back far enough to a world war or something, where, you know, it's a world war, but like the people in Europe are having a very different experience to the people in North America, to the people in Australasia. It's here, everyone is going through the same experience, and so everyone has the same anxieties, and everyone's looking for the same answers. So it just makes it a lot easier.
There's a certain irony, isn't it, that you know, one of the things that the internet said it was going to do was bring the world together as a sort of shared experience, and it turns out this is it. Great, thanks for that.
Well, and also the collective knowledge of the world, right? So that's the other thing that the internet's supposed to deliver us, and it kind of does, except you also get the collective, if you want to go looking for it, you get the collective knowledge of some people who have very weird ideas, and that's true of anything. But yeah, it's
hey Dylan, last question about this. It seems like you've done like a bunch of investigating on this and put all the information out there. Did you actually get into this Zoom? How did you actually, it looks like you've infiltrated it from the outside in, or was this just like anyone could have got in, it was public? Because these people, I think, are being exposed for some ridicule. You know, how did you get all this information? How did you get in there?
This particular instance, they posted recordings of the Zoom. I say publicly, not quite publicly, like they're in, you know, either sort of invite only kind of Telegram channels, or at least places you've got to kind of go looking to find them. Like they're not, you know, they're not on YouTube. But the stuff's not hard to find. And then once you find it, it's, you know, and once you're in also one of these spaces, it's pretty easy to get into other ones.
Right.
So I have, you know, I have sock puppet accounts on Facebook and Telegram that I use for watching various spaces. In this case, like Charlie Mitchell, who wrote the Stuff article, actually spent a lot more time watching that Zoom than I could bring myself to, because I just, you know, I'm a little bit ADHD. I can't quite deal with watching 5 hours of people talking nonsense.
You do kind of wish that these people didn't have Zoom Pro, right?
Yeah,
just,
I
they have the 40-minute
paying
limit
for the Zoom Pro, because she's one of them is 3 hours and one of them is 5 hours. I think altogether it's a little over 8 hours of 2 days of, and they're doing another one the 11th and 12th of April. They've got another grand jury happening. So
two things. Two thoughts with these kinds of people. Normally they're either fervent and ardent believers in what they're saying, or they're grifters and they've found a way to make some money. Are these all believers at the moment that you're seeing getting involved in these?
The sort of the motivated ones appear to be. I think there's often, you know, you'll get people who are in there for trolling, like the Facebook group. There was a couple of comments on the Facebook post that Charlie mentioned in his article, attracted sort of two types of comment. One was people supportive of the idea, and you know, wanting to know when it was going to happen and who's going to get arrested and how's it going down. And other people were people kind of making fun of them in a not super obvious way, that, you know, that they kind of bought into. So there are definitely people out there who are trolling them, and there will be certainly at different times people taking advantage of them. Like I'm assuming that, you know, someone will start selling merchandise or you know, or whatever. But for the most part, the core stuff, there's not really money changing hands. It's people believing a real thing for whatever reason.
Yeah.
And like I have relatives who've kind of gone down some of these rabbit holes, you know, who are as a result effectively bankrupt because they've, you know, written letters to their bank saying they're not the person, they're the living person, not the paper person, and they're no contract with you and stuff. It's like, you know, there are people who throw away a lot of their lives by believing that they can just utter some magic words. So the people go all in on this stuff.
Hey, just because I haven't ever said it to you before, congratulations on the Tickled movie. Really enjoyed it. It was a great thing. And I think you should do a follow-up, and it should be called Slapped, and it should star Will Smith, and you should get onto that today.
I think that I'm almost certain that whatever story there is to tell there has already been optioned.
Yeah, I think Questlove's already on top of that one.
Yeah, just from reading his Twitter. 4 or 5 productions underway on that one.
Oh, and just speaking of, if people want to find your Substack, is that a good place to go and check out your meanderings? Number 8 haywiredob.substack.com to check out.
My theory is I'm going to try and write there sort of once a week or so about just some of the weird internet shit that catches my interest.
Cool. Hey, Dylan Reeve, thanks for joining us. We really appreciate your insights into this issue at the moment.
Thank you.